But the truth is, what we see in the world today and what people say about my generation isn't so jolly and happy. Yeah, I don't know if you saw it, but earlier this month, there was a little bit of a Twitter war. And a bunch of baby boomers got together, and they decided to start a hashtag and to send so many tweets that they could make it trend on Twitter. And the hashtag was how to confuse a millennial. People came with all sorts of things. Hand them an application form. There were some celebrities that showed an appearance as well. Superman chimed in, talking about, as you said, the social that used to exist. Jesus was there. Look at the handle. The Lord has spoke. Just spoke. We'll get into that later. But then a guy named Ethan, he wanted to remind Gen Y why they're even called Gen Y. And he has a pretty good indication or reason why. And here's that. Not cool, Ethan the man. Not cool. So baby boomers took over Twitter, a platform that is designed and used by millions and millions of millennials to then bash millennials. There are all kinds of things being said, and it's pretty tough to find somebody who actually has something positive to say about my generation. You see, the world I grew up in is very different than the world my father's generation grew up in. At Millennial Labs, we study all generations. Specifically, we study how interconnected those generations are. And from a research perspective, not only do we study the nexus of those generations and the underlying values that they all share, but we also look at three specific areas: life cycle effect, where a generation is at in their lifespan; period effect, so what has happened that has shaped the generation in their formative years; and finally, peer effect, which is their counterparts' impact on their political ideologies, their morals, their values. And when you look at the greatest generation, my grandparents' generation, you see that they were shaped from a period effect by two things: the war and the depression. And the depression changed them forever. It also changed the way they would raise their kids. So when my dad was 5 years old, my grandfather came to him and he said, "Joseph, you need to work hard and you need to get a good job. And when you get that good job, you need to be thankful for that job, because that job is a luxury that not everybody will have. And starting on day one, you need to start putting money away for a rainy day, because you never know when the next Great Depression is going to come." He said, "Look at your uncle. He didn't have a rainy day fund, and he lost everything. He lost the cattle, he lost the farm, he lost the equipment, he lost everything down to his name." And then my grandfather closed with the most powerful line of all, and he said, "And son, you ought to not make the same mistakes as he did." The psychological impacts of those conversations that my mother, my father, and many of their peers had with their parents would shape a generation. When you think about the critical inflection point for a career and the world for a 5-year-old at that time, it came down to two things: security and stability. Put it together and you can call it survival. And that's what shaped a generation. It was fear-driven. It was about living a life and making decisions and taking actions to avoid what you didn't want to happen, to avoid the world that you didn't want to face. Now, the baby boomer generation came of age, and as they came of age, there was this newfound optimism, newfound hope. There was also a few music festivals that we won't get into today. But something changed, and baby boomers, you changed the game. Because you had this different belief, this different view on the world that, forget about living in a world that's all about survival. Let's live in a world where anything is possible. You know, people often say millennials are the most altruistic, optimistic generation in history, and I disagree. Because baby boomers, you are. But you just loved your kids so much that while you were working hard and making tens of thousands of sacrifices to provide security and stability, you were letting those possibilities live out in the world through your kids' lives. You knew that the American dream was real, it was alive, and your kids were so special, you were going to let them capture it. They were going to capture it. And when I was 5 years old, my parents came to me and they knelt down next to me. Remember, I was short and fat, so they got pretty low. But they didn't give me the same speech. They didn't tell me about the luxuries of a first job. They didn't tell me about how thankful I ought to be and put money away in the rainy day fund. They didn't instill fear in my life about when the next Great Depression was going to come or talk to me about some distant ancestor who lost everything. In fact, they didn't give me a lecture at all. Instead, they asked me a question. And that question changed everything. And everybody in this room knows exactly what that question was. And she just said it back there. Hey, Paul, what do you want to be when you grow up? The best part was it didn't matter what I said. Doctor, lawyer, astronaut, Fuzzy the rodeo clown. Don't ask me how I came up with that name. But it didn't matter what I said. Their answer was always the same. That's awesome. You can do it. We believe in you. Work hard, dream big, and don't let anybody tell you that it can't be done. And without realizing it at the time, that shaped my generation. Because what was then was security and stability that was really focused on survival. It was fear-driven. But with my generation, it wasn't. Instead, it was about living out our aspirations. It was about opportunity. Because what my parents were really saying that day wasn't just about a career choice. But what they were saying was that at every turn in my life, at every choice point, at every decision I would face, I no longer needed to live in a world where I made decisions based on the world that I didn't want to come my way, but instead I could make decisions and take actions based on the world and the life that was possible. And while baby boomers were working nights and weekends, doing everything they could, going without so their kids could have the opportunity, they were setting up this foundation for a generation that is now credited with all of these things that truthfully should come back to you, the baby boomers. So from my generation to yours, I simply say thank you. Because your actions shaped my life and the lives of my peers. But they also led to a different mindset in the workplace and in the marketplace. And now all of these beautiful things you did, well, now you're crashing course with them and you want to strangle these millennials.